The Man Who Never was not just Ronald Neam's finest war film. It was a government-commissioned act of historical misdirection, dressed up as a thriller written by a former Army brigadier who had spent the war improving British soldiers' efficiency and had been ordered by the security services to write the book the film was based on. Starring an actor whose American accent made British critics quietly furious, built around an Irish spy who never existed, and concealing in plain sight the identity of the actual man whose corpse had won the war, a homeless Welshman who had eaten rat poison in a King's Cross warehouse, and whose name would not be officially acknowledged for another 52 years. We are digging into the wreckage of The Man Who Never Was, with 15 dark secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside declassified security files, Nigel Balchin's biography, Ewan Montague's own contradictory accounts, and the official records of a man who, according to his government, had never quite existed in the first place. The title The Man Who Never Was is the production's most layered deception, operating simultaneously as a description of a fictional officer, a statement about the real man whose body played that officer, and an admission that the film itself was never fully permitted to be honest about what it was depicting. Major William Martin never was. He was a creation of Ewan Montague's intelligence operation, a fictional identity constructed from theater ticket stubs, love letters, tailor's bills, and a borrowed naval photograph. But Glyndwr Michael most certainly was. A man born in Aberbargode in South Wales in 1909, the son of a coal miner who killed himself when Glyndwr was 15, a man who drifted to London through the economic devastation of the 1930s, who was found dying in a King's Cross warehouse after eating rat poison, and who died in St. Pancras Hospital at 34, having achieved almost nothing the world considered noteworthy. The title erases him as surely as the operation had. The Man Who Never Was is simultaneously the fictional officer and the real man the film was prohibited from naming. Both men are called the same thing. Only one of them deserved better. Ronald Neam arrived at The Man Who Never Was in 1955, carrying a reputation as one of Britain's most reliable craftsmen. The cinematographer who had shot Brief Encounter and Great Expectations for David Lean, the co-writer of In Which We Serve, the director of The Card and The £1 Million Note, and carrying simultaneously the specific burden of being known primarily as the man who had made other people's visions work. His directorial career had produced admired, commercially successful films that critics respected without discussing at length. The Man Who Never Was his opportunity to demonstrate that a film could be directed with sufficient formal intelligence to make a procedural, a story about forms, documents, pocket litter, and bureaucratic ingenuity, as suspenseful as any action sequence in any war film of the decade. He succeeded. The film's tension derives entirely from paper, from whether a photograph looks like an officer, from whether a letter has been opened and resealed, from whether a man who never existed is convincing enough to die for his country. Neam understood that the most gripping sequences in war are the ones where the weapons are documents and the battlefield is a bureaucrat's desk. Nigel Balchin had ended World War II as Deputy Scientific Advisor to the Army Council, with the rank of Brigadier, having spent the war first at the Ministry of Food and subsequently advising the Army on what he had been trained to advise, the psychology of men at work, the conditions under which human beings perform at their best under institutional pressure. He was, in other words, the man who had helped the British Army function more efficiently, who had studied the backroom culture of wartime institutional life with a psychologist's precision, and who had subsequently written several of the most admired British novels of the 1940s. The Small Back Room, Mine Own Executioner, from that insider experience. When the security services commissioned Montague to write the book that became The Man Who Never Was, it was published in 1953 as a controlled disclosure, a version of the truth that revealed the operation's basic outlines while protecting its most sensitive methodology. When Balchin received the screenplay commission, he was adapting a book that had itself been written to specifications. His British Academy of Film and Television Arts winning screenplay is therefore an adaptation of a controlled disclosure, a film based on a book that told as much as its government had decided you were permitted to know. The layers of institutional mediation between the actual events and the finished film are 3 deep before Balchin has written a word. The casting of Clifton Webb as Ewan Montague generated precisely the critical response that any observer of the British film industry in 1956 could have predicted: quiet, sustained, pointed dissatisfaction from critics who found a mid-Atlantic American accent speaking lines, written to embody the specific register of the British officer class, about as convincing as a stage property, substituting for the genuine article. Webb had built his Hollywood career playing a specific type, the precisely enunciated, mildly withering, impeccably groomed authority figure, and Montague, as written by Balchin, required exactly that type. The problem, as every British review eventually articulated, was that the type required a British voice. Jack Hawkins had been considered the self-evident choice, the actor who had made institutional authority both admirable and formidable in a dozen British war films of the period. Kenneth More, John Mills, any of the generation of British actors who had actually served in the war and understood from the inside what Montague's professional culture felt like. None of them were chosen. Webb was the American name the American distributor required, and his presence in the film's central role imported into every scene a slight but persistent wrongness of tone that the British audience could never quite set aside. He was right in every particular except nationality, and in a film about the precise construction of a convincing British identity, nationality was the one particular that could not be faked. The film's most dramatically effective sequences, Stephen Boyd's Patrick O'Reilly, the Nazi agent dispatched to London to verify whether Major William Martin actually existed, threading through the city's wartime social fabric, testing the fictional officer's invented history against the genuine memories of genuine people, are entirely fictional, not dramatized, not composite, invented. O'Reilly has no historical counterpart. No German agent was dispatched to London to investigate Martin's existence. The double-cross system, Military Intelligence 5's complete control of the German spy network in Britain, through which every German agent operating on British soil had been turned or was under surveillance, made such a dispatch not merely unnecessary, but impossible. Any agent the Germans sent would have been immediately identified and managed. Nigel Balchin, who knew enough about wartime institutional machinery to understand this, wrote O'Reilly as an acknowledged dramatic fiction, and Montague, consulted throughout the production and appearing in the film himself, declared himself happy with fictitious incidents which, although they did not happen, might have happened. The film's most gripping scenes are the ones that could not have occurred. This is not a failure of fidelity. It is a precise demonstration of what the truth, unembellished, was unable to provide. A human adversary against whom the plan could be tested in real time. In Montague's 1953 book, The Government-Approved Disclosure that formed the film's foundation, the actual man whose body had been transformed into Major William Martin is described as a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and the only worthwhile thing he ever did, he did after his death. This description was the most Montague was officially permitted to say. It acknowledged the body's prior existence as a living human being while withholding his identity. What it did not acknowledge, what could not be acknowledged without undermining the dignity of the operation, was the specific circumstances of Glindra Michael's life and death. He was not a ne'er-do-well. He was a man whose father had committed suicide when he was 15 and whose mother had died when he was 31, who had come to London from the South Wales coalfields that the Depression had destroyed, who had eaten rat poison laced bread in a King's Cross warehouse, whether from hunger or deliberate intent, cannot be determined with certainty, and who had died in St. Pancras Hospital having been categorized by the institutional process of death and disposal as a person of no particular significance. The government that used his body to deceive Hitler did not name him for 53 years. His grave in Huelva, Spain, where Major William Martin is buried, did not bear Glindra Michael's name until 1997. The only worthwhile thing he ever did was described as something he did after his death. The worth was in the living. The recognition came after the recognition was too late to matter. Ewan Montague, the actual Montague, the man upon whose wartime intelligence career the film's central performance was based, appears in The Man Who Never Was as a speaking character, an Air Vice Marshal who conducts a briefing session and questions the Montague character. He is playing a fictional senior officer in a scene that depicts the meeting where Operation Mincemeat was approved. He is in the room where he was in the room. The biographical circularity of this appearance, the real intelligence officer playing a fictional intelligence officer in a scene about the plan he actually conceived, questioning the actor playing him, is one of the more formally extraordinary pieces of casting in post-war British cinema, and was apparently Montague's own suggestion. He was not, it should be noted, playing himself. The character he plays is not identified as Montague, and Montague's appearance in the film allows him to assess the fictional version of his own work from a position of official detachment. He was both the source and the audience. He was the man who was always there, watching the man who never was. Churchill appears in The Man Who Never Was as a voice. His authorization of Operation Mincemeat, communicated by audio only, His presence in the film limited to a few clipped words delivered in the unmistakable cadence of the wartime prime minister. That voice belongs to Peter Sellers, in a performance so precisely calibrated to the acoustic memory of Churchill's actual broadcasts that audiences in 1956 largely received it as authentic archive recording. Sellers was, by 1956, already known for his British Broadcasting Corporation goon show impressions, the comedian whose facility with vocal mimicry was beginning to generate the film career that would eventually produce Dr. Strangelove, Lolita, and The Pink Panther. His Churchill, in The Man Who Never Was, is a non-comedic performance of considerable authority, the same skills deployed in service of dramatic weight rather than satirical deflation, and it was received in the Turner Classic Movies account of the production as utterly convincing by audiences who were unable to identify whose voice they were hearing. The greatest comic impressionist in British cinema history played Churchill straight, without credit, and nobody knew it was him. Nigel Balchin's biographical range is one of the more extraordinary in the history of British intellectual life. Industrial psychologist, wartime brigadier, celebrated novelist, British Academy of Film and Television Arts, winning screenwriter, and, perhaps his most lasting commercial contribution, the man largely responsible for the successful launch of Black Magic chocolates, which he had helped Rowntree's design and market in 1933 as a young industrial psychologist. The biography of the man who wrote The Man Who Never Was, therefore, runs from the creation of one of Britain's most enduring confectionery brands through the deputy scientific advisorship to the Army Council, through three of the most admired British novels of the 1940s to a screenplay about the institutional deployment of a dead man's body against a totalitarian regime. Clive James described Balchin as one of the most important missing writers of the 20th century. The description of missing is precisely accurate. Balchin is missing from the literary canon that should contain him because his alcoholism, documented in Derek Collett's biography as the primary force that made his later writing increasingly uneven, and his commercial orientation placed him outside the categories that academic criticism uses to determine permanent significance. His British Academy of Film and Television Arts for The Man Who Never Was the peak of his screenwriting career. He subsequently worked, uncredited, on Cleopatra, what he described, with wry precision, as the first folio edition of that production, and died in London in 1970, having largely faded from the literary conversation he deserved to occupy. The specific reason the government authorized Montagu to write The Man Who Never Was in 1953 is documented in the Operation Mincemeat Wikipedia record and the National World War II Museum account. Duff Cooper, a former cabinet minister who had been briefed on the operation in March 1943, had published a novel called Operation Heartbreak in 1950 that contained the central plot device of a corpse with false documents being floated off the coast of Spain. The British security services, confronted with a Roman eclef that was rapidly being understood as a disguised account of a real operation, decided that the best countermove was to publish the real story themselves in a controlled form that revealed the broad outlines while protecting the sensitive methodology. Montagu was given a weekend to write the book. He produced it in that weekend. It sold 2 million copies. The film followed. What the genealogy of the production therefore traces is not the standard route from novel to screenplay, but from leaked fictionalization to authorized counter-disclosure to popular adaptation. A film that exists because the government needed to control a narrative that had begun escaping through a novelist's unauthorized proximity to classified information. The film about deception was itself a product of deception management. Among the classified aspects of Operation Mincemeat that Montagu was explicitly prohibited from revealing in his 1953 book, and that therefore could not appear in the 1956 film, was the double-cross system. Military Intelligence 5's complete infiltration and control of the German spy network operating in Britain. The double-cross system was the mechanism by which Britain knew, with certainty, that the Germans had received and acted on the false documents. Every German agent who could have exposed the operation had been turned, and their reports were monitored. The film's Irish spy O'Reilly exists as a dramatic device, specifically because the double-cross system could not be acknowledged, because its existence was still classified, because confirming that Britain had controlled every German agent on its soil would have revealed the precise nature of its wartime intelligence architecture. The invented adversary fills the space left by the actual methodology. The film is not just based on a controlled disclosure. It is shaped, at its most dramatic level, by what the controlled disclosure was required to withhold. Oswald Morris, who had already shot The African Queen and Moulin Rouge for John Huston, and who would subsequently shoot The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, Fiddler on the Roof, and The Man with the Golden Gun, photographed The Man Who Never Was with a visual intelligence that the film's procedural reputation has never adequately recognized. His use of cinemascope in the documentary sequences, the office meetings, the document preparation, the submarine interior, resisted the format's natural tendency toward landscape grandeur and used it instead to create the specific claustrophobia of institutional spaces where important things are happening at desks and in corridors. His lighting in the O'Reilly sequences, particularly the Glasgow Graham telephone scene and the confrontation in the flat, achieves the specific noir register of an occupied city at war, where the ordinary domestic space carries the texture of potential threat. The film that critics praised as restrained and competent was being visualized by one of the most technically sophisticated cinematographers in British film history. The restraint was not the absence of craft. It was craft operating at maximum efficiency. Among the film's most consistently praised sequences is the scene in which Lucy Sherwood, Gloria Graham's American character, the flatmate of Montague's assistant Pam, receives a telephone call at work informing her that her real fiancé has been killed in action. The moment is brief, precise, and devastating, in the specific way that genuinely observed grief is devastating, not operatic, not melodramatic, but the very particular stillness of a person receiving information their nervous system has not yet fully processed. The Turner Classic Movies account of the production identifies this as one of Graham's finest screen moments. The context in which it operates in the narrative is simultaneously the film's most morally complex moment. Lucy's genuine grief, witnessed by the German spy O'Reilly, is what partially convinces him that Martin's fictional fiancée was real, that the letters in the briefcase described a genuine relationship, because the woman who knows the flatmate of the fictional fiancé grieves for a real man with a real face. The operation's success depends, at that moment, on genuine human suffering, standing in for invented human suffering. The film does not comment on this. It simply shows it and allows the audience to sit with the fact that an Allied intelligence victory was facilitated, in part, by a dead man and a grieving woman, neither of whom had chosen to participate in what was being accomplished through them. The critical reception of The Man Who Never Was at its London premiere in February 1956 and its subsequent wide release was generous and technically admiring, with a specific qualification applied almost universally. Clifton Webb was wrong. The Times praised the film's pace and the O'Reilly subplot, while noting with diplomatic understatement that Webb's American accent slightly detached him from the role's national requirements. The Monthly Film Bulletin was more specific, observing that the film's documentary authority was undermined at its center by a performance whose tonality belonged to Hollywood rather than to Whitehall. On the positive side, Stephen Boyd's breakthrough performance as O'Reilly, taut, committed, playing an invented character with the conviction of someone who had been given a fully realized human being, drew consistent praise. The British Academy of Film and Television Arts for Balchin's screenplay acknowledged that the film's most invisible achievement was its structural intelligence. The way the script had taken a government-approved disclosure and constructed from it a thriller whose tension was entirely genuine, despite the fact that any audience member who had read the book already knew the outcome. One quote, "The critics who found the film too reverent were measuring it against the standards of cynicism that the late 1950s were developing. By the standards of the event it was depicting, the reverence was the point." The 7 decades since the film's release have produced 2 developments that have substantially altered how it can be understood. The first is the declassification of Glyndwr Michael's identity in 1996, and the subsequent addition of his name to the grave in Huelva, the formal acknowledgement that the man who never was had been a real person whose name the film had been institutionally prohibited from using. The second is Ben McIntyre's 2010 book Operation Mincemeat, which drew on the newly released documents to reconstruct the full story that Montague's 1953 account had been required to withhold, including the double-cross system, the precise nature of the signals intelligence that confirmed the operation's success, and the full character portraits of the people involved. The film that was made from a controlled disclosure can now be watched against the knowledge of what the control was concealing. That knowledge does not diminish it, it deepens it. The film's restraint, its deliberate procedural calm, its insistence on the mundane detail of document preparation and identity construction look different once you understand that the calm was the product of what could not be said, rather than of what had been said completely. The film that survived, made from a government-commissioned book written over a weekend to manage an unauthorized disclosure, adapted by a brigadier who had spent the war studying how human beings perform under institutional pressure, starring an American whose accent irritated everyone, built around a spy who never existed, and a man whose name the film was not permitted to use for another 50 years, is the most honestly dishonest British war film ever made. It is honest about the procedure. It is dishonest about the human cost, because it was institutionally prohibited from being honest about it. Glindra Michael's name is not in the film. His story is not in the film. His grave in Huelva bears his name now, but did not bear it in 1956. And the film that celebrated the operation that put him in that grave never acknowledged that there was a name to bear. The man who never was had a name. The film that bears his title had no mechanism to speak it. But here is the question that the man who never was leaves embedded in that grave in Huelva, in that stone that bore only one name for 54 years. If the most successful British intelligence operation of World War II, the operation historians call the greatest deception in the history of military deception, depended for its success on a man whose poverty, whose isolation, whose obscurity made him available to be used. And if the government that used him did not acknowledge his name for 53 years, and if the film that celebrated what he made possible was prohibited from naming him, then what does that tell you about whose lives the machinery of institutional heroism runs on? And if the answer is always the same answer, that the people without resources are the people most available to be instrumentalized by the people with them, which operations being celebrated right now are running on people whose names nobody will acknowledge for another 50 years? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see the man who never was, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.